The dust was a living thing, a shroud that clung to the memory of rain. It coated the cracked leather of Elias Thorne's saddle and settled in the lines around his eyes, lines carved not by laughter but by the steady, grinding pressure of loss. For a year, the silence of his ranch had been a tomb, the wind whistling through the eaves a constant, mournful hymn for his wife, Mary, and his boy, little Thomas. He rode the fence line not because it needed mending, but because the routine was the only thing holding the pieces of him together. The rhythmic creak of the saddle, the familiar weight of the tools, the vast, indifferent sky, these were the bars of his self-imposed prison. It was on the far edge of his property, where the land gave way to unclaimed scrub and rock, that the silence was broken. It wasn't the cry of a hawk or the rustle of a coyote. It was a sound that didn't belong, a weak, desperate scraping from the direction of an old, abandoned line shack, a place he hadn't thought of in years. He dismounted, his hand resting on the worn stock of the rifle in its scabbard, a reflex born of habit rather than fear. The air grew heavy, thick with the stench of decay and misery. The shack's door hung crooked on a single leather hinge, a dark mouth gaping into the gloom. He peered inside, his eyes adjusting to the darkness, and the world tilted on its axis. 3 children. They were huddled in the far corner like a litter of stray pups, their bones sharp angles beneath rags that might have once been clothes. The oldest, a girl of maybe 10 or 11, held a protective arm around a younger boy, her eyes wide and dark with a fierce, cornered animal terror. The youngest, no older than his Thomas would have been, was on his knees. Before them was a rusted slop bucket, the kind used for swine, filled with a brackish, scummy water. The boy, the little one, was dipping his cupped hands into the foul liquid and bringing it to his mouth, his small body trembling with each desperate sip. The sound Elias had heard was the girl's fingernails scraping the dry bottom of a tin can, trying to find one more morsel of whatever forgotten scrap had been inside. Elias felt the air leave his lungs. The grief that was his constant companion, a cold stone in his gut, flared into a hot, angry fire. He said nothing. Words were useless things here. He took a slow step into the shack, raising his hands, palms open, to show he was unarmed. The girl flinched, pulling the 2 boys tighter against her. Her lips peeled back in a silent snarl. She was a she-wolf guarding her cubs, ready to fight a grizzly to the death. Easy, Elias's voice was a rusted hinge, rough from disuse. I ain't gonna hurt you. He looked at the slop bucket, then back at their hollowed eyes and gaunt faces. The world outside, his grief, his empty house, it all fell away. There was only this. This profound, elemental suffering. He backed out of the shack slowly, his mind a sudden, jarring cacophony of purpose. He walked to his horse, unstrapped his canteen, and uncorked it. The sound of the water sloshing within was deafening in the still air. He placed it just inside the doorway, then retreated again, sitting on a sun-bleached log 20 feet away. He waited. The sun beat down, the dust devils danced, and from the dark mouth of the shack, 3 sets of eyes watched him, weighing a terror of the known against a terror of the unknown. An hour passed. Then, the smallest boy, driven by a thirst that overpowered fear, crawled on his hands and knees toward the canteen. They stayed at the shack for 2 days. Elias didn't push. He brought them food from his saddlebags, jerky and hardtack, leaving it on the log and retreating. He'd watch the small, ghost-like figures dart out, snatch the offerings, and disappear back into the darkness. He spoke to them in low, calm tones, telling them his name was Elias, that he had a ranch with a deep well of clean water. He talked about his horse, Bess, more than he talked about himself. On the 3rd morning, the girl appeared at the doorway. She didn't look at him, but at the horizon. "They'll find us," she said, her voice a dry rasp. It was the first time she had spoken a full sentence. Elias looked where she was looking, at the endless expanse of dusty plain. "Who's they?" he asked. She just shook her head, her thin shoulders slumping. He knew then that waiting was no longer an option. He walked to the shack, his shadow falling over them. "My house has beds," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "It has a stove. A roof that don't leak." He looked at the little one, Samuel, whose eyes were glassy with fever. "It's time to come out of the dark." The girl, Ilara looked at her brother, Caleb, who simply stared at the floor, then at the feverish Samuel. She made a choice. With a resolve that seemed too big for her small frame, she helped her brothers to their feet, and together they stepped out into the blinding sun, a trinity of ghosts leaving their tomb. He led Bess, letting them walk beside him, their pace slow and unsteady. The journey back to his ranch was a silent procession, a funeral for a life he thought was over and the baptism of one he never could have imagined. They were no longer just a crisis he'd stumbled upon, they were a weight in his hands, a responsibility that settled deep in his bones, pushing aside the cold stone of his grief with its terrifying, fragile warmth. The ranch house was a testament to a life interrupted. Mary's sewing basket sat by the cold hearth, a needle still threaded in a half-mended shirt. Thomas's small wooden soldiers stood frozen in a perpetual battle on the mantelpiece. For a year, these artifacts had been extensions of his pain, sacred relics of a world that was gone. Now, as he ushered the 3 silent children inside, they became accusations. The house was too quiet, too clean, too empty. It was a place for ghosts, and these children were too real, their suffering a raw, open wound in the sterile environment of his grief. He led them to the kitchen, the heart of the home that had not beaten in a year. He pumped water from the well into a basin, the clean, clear liquid a stark contrast to the filth of the slop bucket. He set it on the table alongside a bar of soap and clean rags. The children stared at it as if it were a trick. Ilara, the fierce guardian, stood between him and her brothers, her small body a rigid barrier. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice low and suspicious. It was the question of a creature who had only ever known transactions, where every kindness had a hidden, brutal price. Elias looked at her, at the dirt caked on her skin, the matted tangles of her hair. He thought of Mary, of the gentle way she had bathed Thomas, her hands sure and loving. The memory was a knife twist, but for the first time, it didn't just bring pain. It brought a blueprint. "To get the dirt off," he said, his voice flat. "Then, food. Real food." He left them in the kitchen, giving them the illusion of privacy, but he watched from the doorway as Ilara hesitantly dipped a rag in the water and began to scrub at Samuel's face with a desperate, clumsy tenderness. Caleb, the silent one, simply watched, his eyes missing nothing. Elias turned to the stove, his hands clumsy as he stirred the embers and added kindling. He found a sack of potatoes and some smoked bacon. The smell of it cooking, a scent that had been absent for so long, filled the house with a strange, foreign promise. He set out 3 plates on the heavy wooden table, plates that had gathered a fine layer of dust. He wiped them clean with his sleeve. When the food was ready, he placed it before them. They ate like starving wolves, not speaking, their eyes darting up at him between frantic bites, as if expecting him to snatch the plates away at any moment. When they were finished, Ilara stacked the plates neatly, a gesture of ingrained, fearful servitude that tightened Elias's chest. That night, he laid out 3 cots in his son's old room. He didn't have the heart to clear out Thomas's things, so the cots sat beside the small wooden bed and the chest of toys. The children huddled together on one cot, a single entity of fear and exhaustion, refusing to be separated. Elias left the door ajar and sat in the main room, the rifle across his lap, watching the shadows dance in the firelight. He didn't sleep. He listened to the house breathe with new life, and it was the most terrifying and hopeful sound he had ever heard. Days bled into one another, marked by a slow, painstaking rhythm of earned inches. Trust was not given, it was excavated, millimeter by millimeter, from beneath layers of impacted trauma. Elias never pushed. He'd rise before the sun, do his chores, and leave food on the kitchen table. He'd find their clothes, torn and filthy, and leave clean, mended replacements in their place, some of Mary's smaller shirts, some of his own cut down and inexpertly stitched. He noticed Caleb's fascination with a piece of scrap pine and a small whittling knife he used for mending harnesses. One morning, he left the knife and a fresh block of cedar on the porch railing. He didn't say a word. Hours later, he saw Caleb sitting on the steps, the wood in his hands, slowly, carefully, shaving away slivers. A small, rough shape of a bird began to emerge. Ilara remained his shadow, her suspicion a constant, silent presence. She watched him mend a fence, her eyes tracking his every move, the stretch and pull of the wire, the solid thud of the post driver. He was capable. He was strong. But there was a gentleness in his hands she couldn't reconcile with the men she had known. Men's hands were for hitting, for taking. Elias's hands were for fixing. One afternoon, she found him in the barn, brushing down Bess. "Why?" she asked, her voice small. Elias stopped, turning to her. "Why what? Why are you feeding us?" "We ain't yours." The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations. Elias turned back to the horse, running the brush along its powerful flank. "A thing's not right when it's starving," he said, as much to the horse as to her. "Doesn't matter if it's yours or not. You fix it." The simplicity of his answer offered no purchase for her suspicion, and she fell silent, watching his hands. The breakthrough came a week after their arrival. It was late afternoon, the sun casting long, golden shadows across the yard. Elias was coming back from the well, a heavy bucket of water in each hand. His leg, injured in a fall years ago, ached with a dull, familiar throb. He was lost in the fog of his own thoughts, the ever-present ache of his grief mingling with the new, sharp anxiety of his responsibility for the children. He didn't see the small figure dart out from behind the water trough. He only felt the sudden, desperate grasp around his thigh. He froze, looking down. It was Samuel. The little boy had his arms wrapped tightly around Elias's leg, his face buried in the rough denim of his trousers. His small body was trembling, but it wasn't from fear. Elias carefully set the buckets down, the water sloshing over the rims. He didn't know what to do. He had not been touched with affection, had not initiated it, in over a year. His body was a fortress, and this small child had just breached the walls without a fight. He slowly, hesitantly, rested a hand on the boy's matted hair. It was a gesture that felt both alien and deeply familiar. Samuel didn't flinch. He just held on tighter, a silent, desperate plea for anchorage in a world that had been a raging sea. Elias stood there for a long time, the warmth of the small body seeping through the denim, thawing a part of his soul he thought had frozen solid forever. In that moment, the boy wasn't just an orphan he had rescued, he was an anchor, too, holding Elias to the present, refusing to let him drift away completely into the past. He looked up toward the house and saw Elara and Caleb standing on the porch, watching. There was no suspicion in their eyes now. Only a fragile, dawning wonder. The peace of that moment was so profound, so complete, that it felt like a prayer. But Elias knew the way of the world. Peace this pure was never left unchallenged for long. It was a calm that could only come before a storm. The fragile peace settled over the ranch like a morning mist, delicate and easily burned away. A routine, unforced and natural, began to form. Elara, seeing that her labor was not demanded, began to offer it. She would sweep the porch or help knead bread, her movements deft and sure, a quiet pride in her work. She began to speak more, asking Elias the names of the tools in the barn, the types of clouds in the sky. Caleb's bird carving grew more intricate, its wings seeming to hold the promise of flight. He was still silent, but his silence was no longer born of terror, it was the quiet of concentration, of a boy finding a language for his hands. Samuel, emboldened by his single act of courage, became Elias's shadow, trailing him through his chores, his small hand often finding its way into Elias's large, calloused one. The empty spaces in the house began to fill. The silence was no longer the oppressive weight of grief but the comfortable quiet of cohabitation, punctuated by the scuff of small boots on the floorboards or a rare, whispered conversation between siblings. Elias found himself mending Thomas's old swing, its ropes rotted through. He told himself it was for Samuel, but as he worked the new rope through the weathered wood, he knew he was mending something inside himself. One morning, he rode into the small town of Redemption for supplies. It was a place he had avoided, a place full of sympathetic glances and clumsy condolences he couldn't bear. But now, he had 3 other mouths to feed. He tied Bess to the hitching post outside the general store, his list, flour, beans, salt, 3 pairs of sturdy shoes, clutched in his hand. As he stepped onto the boardwalk, he saw Sheriff Brody leaning against a post, whittling a piece of wood with a long, lazy knife. Brody was a man who operated by the letter of the law, a book that had little room for the complexities of the human heart. "Thorn," Brody acknowledged, not looking up from his work. "Been a while and needed supplies," Elias said, his voice clipped. Brody finally looked up, his eyes cold and assessing. "Heard you've had company out at your place. Some folks saw smoke from your chimney regular." "Heard?" Voices. The casual tone was a thinly veiled interrogation. Elias's hand tightened on his list. "Just company." "Funny thing," Brody continued, flicking a sliver of wood into the dust. "Got a notice a few weeks back. From up north. A man named Blackwood lost his stepchildren. 2 boys and a girl. Seems they ran off after he tried to put them in a church orphanage. For their own good, of course. His offering a reward." Each word was a hammer blow against the fragile structure of peace Elias had built. Blackwood. The name was a venomous thing. He could see the terror in Elara's eyes, could feel the source of her wounds. "They're just children, Brody," Elias said, his voice a low growl. "Their property, according to the law," the sheriff countered, his gaze unwavering. "Wards of the state, entrusted to their legal guardian. A man's got a right to his property." The word landed like a whip crack. Property. It was the same cold, dead word used for cattle, for a sack of grain. It denied them their breath, their fear, their fragile, emerging hope. "They ain't property," Elias stated, the words leaving his mouth with the force of a final, irrevocable creed. A line had been drawn in the dust of that street. Sheriff Brody stood up, brushing the wood shavings from his trousers. "I'm just a man who enforces the law, Elias. This Blackwood fella, he's on his way. Sent a wire he'd be here by the end of the week to collect what's his. I'd advise you to have them ready. It'll be easier on everyone. Especially them." He gestured with his knife toward the open plains. "Don't make me come out there." Elias stood frozen on the boardwalk long after the sheriff had gone. The supplies were forgotten. The sun felt cold. The notice, the reward, the name Blackwood, it was the storm he had sensed gathering on the horizon, and it was no longer distant. It was here. He mounted Bess and rode hard, the rhythmic beat of her hooves a frantic drum against the sudden, suffocating silence. He was no longer just a grieving man offering shelter, he was a guardian. A protector. The ride back was a blur of dust and dread. As he crested the last rise and saw his ranch nestled in the valley below, a thin curl of smoke rising from the chimney, it wasn't just a house he was looking at. It was a sanctuary. It was a home. And a wolf was coming for the lambs he had gathered inside. When he walked through the door, the smell of baking bread met him. Elara looked up from the table, a dusting of flour on her nose, a hesitant smile on her face that died the second she saw his expression. Samuel ran to him, but stopped short, sensing the new, dangerous tension in the man who had become his rock. "What is it?" Elara whispered, her voice trembling. Elias looked at the 3 of them, at the life that had begun to bloom in their eyes, the color that had returned to their cheeks. He saw Caleb's hand tighten on the small wooden bird in his pocket. He had brought them out of the dark, only to lead them into the path of a monster. The law was on the monster's side. The world was on the monster's side. All he had was a lonely ranch, an old rifle, and a conviction that burned hotter than any lawman's decree. They weren't property. He would not let them be taken. The end of the week arrived not with a clock's chime, but with a shift in the wind. It carried the scent of dust and distant sweat, the sound of approaching hoofbeats that were heavier, more deliberate than those of a lone rider. Elias stood on his porch, the Winchester rifle held loosely in his hands. It felt less like a tool and more like an extension of his will. Inside the house, the children were hidden. He had boarded up the small window in Thomas's room, now their room, and told them not to make a sound, no matter what they heard. He'd seen the stark terror return to Elara's eyes, the way Caleb's hands went still, the way Samuel clung to his sister's leg. The fragile trust of the past weeks was being tested by an old, familiar fear. He had made them a promise with his eyes, a silent vow that the walls of this house would hold. It was a promise he intended to keep, or die trying. 2 riders crested the hill. The first was Sheriff Brody, his badge a small, glinting star of indifference on his chest. The second man was taller, dressed in a black duster that seemed to suck the very light from the air around him. He sat his horse with a smug, proprietary arrogance. This was Blackwood. His face was sharp and cruel, with small, dark eyes that scanned the ranch not as a home, but as a ledger, assessing its value, its contents. They reined in their horses in the yard. Brody stayed mounted, his expression impassive, a man merely doing a job. Blackwood swung down from his saddle with a fluid, predatory grace. He ignored Elias completely, his gaze fixed on the house, on the front door, as if he could see through the wood to the children cowering inside. "So this is the hovel they ran to," Blackwood said, his voice a smooth, contemptuous sneer. He took a step toward the porch. "Sheriff tells me you've been playing a nursemaid to my property, old man." Elias shifted his weight, the rifle now held more purposefully across his chest. "They're children. They have names." Blackwood laughed, a short, ugly sound. "They have the names I gave them. They eat the food I provide. They live under my roof. That makes them mine." He took another step, his hand resting on the butt of a pistol holstered at his hip. "I've come to collect what belongs to me. The law is with me. The sheriff is with me. You are a lonely, grieving man on a failing ranch. Now, are you going to step aside, or do you want to die for 3 strays that ain't even your own blood?" Sheriff Brody shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Thorne, listen to him. There's no winning this." Elias's world narrowed to the space between him and Silas Blackwood. The wind, the sun, the presence of the law, it all faded into a dull background hum. There was only the wolf at the door and the promise he had made. "You lay one hand on that door," Elias said, his voice low and steady, a rumble of thunder from a distant storm, "and I'll send you back to whatever hell you crawled out of." Blackwood's sneer widened. He saw Elias not as a threat, but as a pathetic obstacle. Brave words. "Let's see what they're worth." He started up the porch steps, his boots thudding a death knell on the old wood. Elias didn't raise the rifle to his shoulder. He didn't need to. As Blackwood reached the top step, Elias moved. It wasn't the clumsy, aching movement of an old rancher. It was the explosive, economical motion of a man who had seen battle, a man for whom violence was a last, terrible resort, but a familiar one. He lunged forward, not with the rifles but with its steel barrel, driving it hard into Blackwood's gut. The air rushed out of the taller man in a shocked gasp. He stumbled backward, his hand flying to his pistol, but he was too slow. Elias was on him, a whirlwind of focused fury. He wasn't fighting for his own life. He was fighting for the flicker of hope in Elara's eyes, for the quiet dignity of Caleb's carving, for the simple, trusting weight of Samuel's hug. He was fighting for the family that had taken root in the barren soil of his heart. The fight was not a duel, it was an execution of a threat. Elias disarmed Blackwood with a brutal twist of his wrist, sending the pistol skittering across the yard. He drove his fist into the man's smug face, the crack of bone a satisfying punctuation to his silent rage. Blackwood fell back, tripping down the steps and landing in a heap in the dust he so disdained. He came up spitting blood and fury, pulling a long knife from his boot. He charged, a wild, guttural scream tearing from his throat. Elias stood his ground. He didn't retreat. He met the charge, deflecting the knife arm and driving the hard stock of the Winchester into Blackwood's temple. The sound was a sickening thud, final and absolute. Blackwood dropped like a stone, his eyes wide with a surprise that would never fade. He lay still in the dirt, the black duster spread around him like broken wings. Silence descended, broken only by the panting of Elias's breath and the nervous stamping of the horses. Sheriff Brody stared, his hand frozen halfway to his own gun. He had seen a grieving rancher defend his property. He had not expected to see a lion defend his pride. He looked from the body on the ground to the unyielding figure on the porch. He saw the righteous fury in Elias's eyes, a force far more potent and terrifying than any written law. He looked at the house, where he knew 3 children were listening, their futures hanging on his next word. Brody was a man of the law, but he was also a man who knew when a law was wrong, when it was nothing more than a shield for wickedness. He slowly let his hand fall away from his pistol. He cleared his throat. "Looks to me," the sheriff said, his voice carefully neutral, like a known fugitive named Blackwood, wanted for horse theft down in the territory, resisted arrest. "And you, Thorne, were forced to defend yourself." He paused, his gaze meeting Elias's. "That's how the report will read." He turned his horse without another word, collected Blackwood's riderless mount, and rode away, leaving the body where it lay. He didn't look back. The law had come to the Thorne ranch and found something older, something true. It had found justice. Elias stood on the porch, the rifle heavy in his hands, watching until the sheriff was just a speck on the horizon. The storm had passed. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't empty or oppressive. It was a space to breathe, a quiet field after a cleansing rain. Elias didn't move for a long time. He stood over Blackwood's body, not with triumph, but with a profound and somber finality. This was the cost of peace. This was the price of protecting a future. He eventually turned and walked back to the house, the Winchester hanging limp in his hand. He unboarded the window and opened the door to their room. The 3 of them were huddled together on the cot, their faces pale, their eyes enormous. Elara held a broken piece of a chair leg like a club. Caleb clutched his small, half-finished bird. Samuel was crying silently into his sister's shoulder. They looked at Elias, at the blood on his knuckles and the grim set of his jaw, and they did not see a monster. They saw a savior. He knelt, his bad leg protesting, so he was on their level. "It's over," he said, his voice raw. "He's gone. He will never hurt you again." The words hung in the air, a promise fulfilled. Elara slowly lowered the chair leg. Caleb's hand uncurled from the wooden bird. And Samuel, letting go of his sister, launched himself into Elias's arms, burying his face in the man's chest, his small sobs of terror turning into great, gulping cries of relief. Elias wrapped his arms around the boy, holding him tight, and for the first time since Mary's passing, he felt the fortress around his heart crumble completely, turning to dust. He pulled the other 2 into the embrace, a broken man and 3 broken children, forming a new, whole thing in the middle of that small, dusty room. Life on the ranch found a new rhythm, one built not on survival, but on living. The shadow of Silas Blackwood was buried with his body in an unmarked grave at the edge of the property, a final, silent testament to the past being overcome. Sheriff Brody never spoke of the incident again. Papers arrived some months later, official documents from a territorial judge, relinquishing guardianship of the Blackwood wards and granting it to one Elias Thorne, citing abandonment and the guardian's own fugitive status. The law, for once, had bent toward morality. The ranch began to heal, and so did its inhabitants. Elara's fierce protectiveness softened into a quiet, steady strength. She learned to read from Mary's old books, her voice growing more confident with every page. Caleb finished his bird and carved 2 more, a family of them, which Elias helped him hang from the porch rafters where they twisted and danced in the wind, perpetually free. He began to speak, his voice soft at first, asking Elias how to splice a rope, how to read the clouds for rain. His silence had not been empty, it had been full of observation, and now he had questions for all he had seen. Samuel's laughter became a common sound, as bright and clear as the water from the well. He followed Elias everywhere, his small hand a constant, warm presence in the ranches. He would sit on the fence and watch Elias work, chattering about the day, about the hawk he saw, about the funny shape of a cloud. The empty chair at the dinner table was filled. The small bedroom was no longer a memorial to a ghost, it was a vibrant, messy space filled with the lives of 3 children. Thomas's wooden soldiers now stood guard over Caleb's carvings on the mantelpiece, ghosts of the past protecting the hope of the future. One cool autumn evening, as the sun bled orange and purple across the horizon, Elias sat on the porch steps, watching the 3 carved birds spin in the breeze. Elara sat beside him, reading aloud from a book, her voice clear and steady. In the yard, Caleb was showing Samuel how to properly stack firewood, their movements a mirror of the lessons Elias had taught him. The ranch was no longer a place of silence and memory. It was a place of life, of purpose, of noise. It was a home. Elias looked at the children, at the trust in their eyes, at the peace that had settled in their features. He had found them drinking from a slop bucket, feral and broken, creatures of shadow and fear. Now, they were just children, learning to claim the childhood that had been stolen from them. He had thought his life was over, that his heart had been buried with his wife and son. But he had been wrong. He hadn't saved them. In the end, they had saved him. They had filled the hollow spaces, mended the broken fences of his soul, and shown him that a family is not just a thing of blood, but a thing you build, a thing you fight for, a thing you protect with every fiber of your being. The wind picked up, making the wooden birds dance. It was a wind of change, a wind of hope, and for the first time in a very long time, Elias Thorne smiled. What do you think of Elias's journey? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more inspirational stories like this one.